Recently, I've published a couple of videos challenging materialism. The responses I've received so far demonstrate a complete failure on the part of materialists to even understand the seriousness of the problem, much less to offer a solution to it. My challenge to materialists unavoidably leads to the problem of solipsism. They mistakenly infer from this that I'm arguing for solipsism. What they fail to see is that it is the belief in materialism that creates the problem of solipsism and makes it impossible to solve. I'm not a solipsist. I'm an immaterialist or an idealist. I can solve the problem of solipsism, but I can't offer them my solution until they let go of the belief that is causing the problem in the first place. Really, there is no problem of solipsism. The problem of solipsism is a purely imaginary one, created by the belief in materialism. If you haven't already seen my video entitled 7 Reasons Why Atheists Should Reject Belief in Materialism, I recommend watching it for a brief explanation of why I think materialism should be rejected. My video All Is Number is another one to check out for a fuller understanding of my position. In my challenge to materialists, I give materialists an opportunity to try to define matter. Usually they give some vague, fuzzy answer like, matter has mass and volume. Well, if they asked me to define consciousness, and I answered that consciousness doesn't have mass or volume, they would probably accuse me of giving a vague, fuzzy answer, and failing to actually define what consciousness is. What they really want is a definition that defines consciousness in materialistic terms. But consciousness isn't material. The whole problem of solipsism begins to arise the moment we attempt to describe consciousness as physical activity in the brain. We can observe neurons firing in the brain, but this is not consciousness. It may indicate conscious activity, but it is not consciousness itself. If scientists hook you up to a machine that monitors brain activity, and then they stick a needle under your fingernail, the machine may show electrical signals passing the information to your brain. It may show certain areas of your brain light up, but this is not the same as the subjective, first-person experience of pain. By consciousness, I mean that which experiences. You can measure electrical activity in a computer or cell phone, but it isn't like anything to be a computer or cell phone. There isn't any experience of being a rock. Someone might say that maybe there is. How can we know for sure? I'm not going to bother arguing with them. I think that materialists will agree that there is no experience of being a rock. It isn't like anything to be a rock. When we get to plant life, I think there may be some degree of consciousness. A tree is able to respond to environmental stimuli. When you hit a pool ball, there is a reaction, but not a response. A reaction is not the same as a response. If I drop a rock, it falls to the floor. But this isn't the same thing as when a plant grows toward the light. The plant is alive, and the ability to respond to environmental stimuli is one of the characteristics scientists attribute to living things. It's part of the definition of what it means to be alive. Of course, we don't think that plants are intelligent in the same way that higher animal life is, and we don't think that even intelligent animals, such as dogs or horses, have intelligence on the same level as humans. And of course, some humans are more intelligent than others. Some are on a higher level of consciousness than others. We can observe the biological evolution of living organisms. Consciousness itself can't be explained by materialistic science, though. It is simply absurd to believe that unconscious particles bumping into each other can suddenly be conscious. Some materialists appeal to complexity, as if once enough particles bump into each other, consciousness suddenly appears, by magic. The belief in consciousness coming into being out of a material universe is pure magical thinking. And most materialists recognize this, so they prefer to avoid the subject and pretend that consciousness doesn't exist, or that it's some kind of illusion. Of course, consciousness is the one thing that can't possibly be an illusion, and is the one thing it's impossible to doubt the existence of. If this isn't obvious to anyone, I'll refer them to Descartes' famous argument. For the sake of the discussion, I'm going to step inside the materialist worldview for a moment. Let's just assume that before living, conscious creatures appeared, there was only dead, unconscious matter. It's impossible to imagine such a world, of course, since such a world would not look like anything, sound like anything, feel like anything, smell like anything, or taste like anything. All sense perceptions exist within consciousness. If you strip away the qualities of perception, which only exist within the mind of the perceiver, you're left with something completely abstract, and unlike anything you can even try to imagine. But even though it's impossible to imagine such an abstract material universe, let's say that it existed. And somehow, by some kind of magic, some simple organism became capable of having some basic level of subjective experience. For the sake of the argument, I'll grant this second miracle, which allows life and consciousness to magic itself into existence, in addition to the first miracle, which allows matter to magic itself into existence in the first place, and then to magically become conscious of itself. From there, it's easy to grant the long, slow process of evolution which eventually produced human intelligence and consciousness. I'm willing to grant all of that for the sake of the argument, simply to give the materialist enough rope to hang himself. Even if you start from the assumption that materialism is true, you're left with the fact that the material world you know is a mental perception that exists in your mind. You don't experience the material world directly. You experience the material world indirectly through sense perception. You experience a mental representation of the physical world, not the physical world itself. And of course, people have invented telescopes and microscopes and stethoscopes and all sorts of other instruments to enhance our ability to observe the physical world. But even when you look into a microscope, whatever you actually see is a mental representation of whatever is on the slide, and not the thing on the slide itself. When you look at Saturn through a telescope, what you're seeing is a mental representation of Saturn. No scientifically literate person can deny that this is true. And this is where belief in materialism leads unavoidably into the problem of solipsism. Now, the soft problem of solipsism has to do with the reliability of your sense data. There is a physical world out there from which your sense organs receive sense data. But there's the problem of knowing how much data from the physical world your sense organs are able to pick up. Of course, your eyes don't see infrared or ultraviolet, and your ears can only hear sound within a certain frequency range. It's impossible to estimate what percentage of what exists in the physical world is even accessible to your senses. But scientific instruments do reveal that there is much more to the physical universe than can be known through our five senses alone. How much more is there that exists even beyond what is accessible through our scientific instruments? But even if we're only talking about the small sliver of physical reality which we can access through our five senses, even with the aid of special instruments, how can we have confidence that our senses accurately receive data? How do we know that our senses don't deceive us? It's very easy to demonstrate that we are sometimes deceived by our senses. How can we be certain that our brains accurately translate sense data into mental perceptions which closely approximate the outside physical world? How do we know that our mental representations of the physical world closely resemble the physical world itself, as it actually exists outside of our minds? It isn't as if we can compare our mental representations of things to the things themselves. We can only know the things themselves as mental representations. But the hard problem of solipsism is how we can even know that there is a physical world that exists outside of our minds at all. I use the dream analogy a lot because it helps us to think about the problem, not because I'm arguing that we are literally inside of a dream. I'm always amused when materialists think they have an answer to my challenge, because it's usually painfully obvious that they haven't actually thought it through. A couple of guys have tried to argue that when you drink alcohol, you get drunk, so obviously that proves materialism. Of course, this proves absolutely nothing. I know I've had dreams where I dreamed I was drinking, and guess what? I got drunk in the dream. Inside the dream, it seems as though the alcohol in the drink caused chemical changes in my brain which produced an altered state of consciousness. But of course that was all a part of the dream. You dreamed that you drank alcohol, and you dreamed that you became drunk as a result of drinking the alcohol. Nothing about that proves that the alcohol you drank in the dream existed outside the dream. Object permanence doesn't prove anything either. If you dream that you walk out of a room and leave your wallet behind, and then dream that you walk back into the room to find that your wallet is still there, that doesn't prove that the wallet exists outside of the dream. The fact that you can't consciously control things and events doesn't prove materialism either. I have had lucid dreams where I could control the dreams, but for the most part, when I dream, I experience the dream as if it were happening independently of me. When I talk to people in a dream, they behave as if they had a mind of their own. I don't direct them on what to say or what to do. They behave as if they were free agents. Of course, ultimately, the words and actions of characters within the dream are directed by the mind of the dreamer, just as the words and actions of the character with whom the dreamer identifies within the dream are directed by the mind of the dreamer. So it isn't that the other characters in the dream exist within the mind of the character whom the dreamer experiences himself as in the dream. They exist independently of the character the dreamer identifies as himself within the dream. But both they and the character in the dream he identifies himself as being exist within the dreaming mind. The materialist may object that the dream itself was caused by the physical brain, but this is circular reasoning, because they're assuming the conclusion in their premise. They're assuming that there are physical brains that exist in the material world, but we only know about brains indirectly through our mental perception. If your premise is that a dream is caused by brain activity, you're assuming the conclusion that a physical world exists. It is impossible to conclude that consciousness is caused by the brain without assuming that there is a physical world that exists outside of consciousness. That is the very premise that I'm challenging the materialist to prove. I know that consciousness exists, and I know that mental experiences exist. We've established that. And from my perspective, those mental experiences are real. From a materialist perspective, this sounds like saying that there is no real world. They believe that real means physical. They believe that there is a physical world that exists outside of the mental world which we perceive. And they believe that the mental world we experience is a kind of illusion. They believe our mental images are only representations of the real world. So really, they're the ones who believe that we're living inside of a dream world. I say that our mental experiences are real. What really exists is consciousness and mental experiences within consciousness. That is the real world. The so-called physical world that materialists believe in is just a belief that they have in their minds. There is absolutely no good reason to believe that such a world exists, or that anything exists beyond consciousness and the world of mental experience. The material world that materialists believe in is no different from the heaven that Christians believe in. It's unverifiable and unfalsifiable. I can't prove the material world doesn't exist, any more than I can prove that heaven doesn't exist. You can't prove a negative. But as I've said many times, and as atheistic materialists agree, disbelief is the default position. I don't need to be able to disprove something that hasn't been proven in order to justify not believing in it. I don't believe in unicorns. I can't prove that unicorns don't exist, but I've not been presented with any evidence or any good reasons to believe that they do, so I don't believe in unicorns. Imagine how frustrating it would be to get into an argument with someone who insists on believing that unicorns exist until you can prove otherwise. This is what it's like to argue with religious people and materialists. If Christians believe in heaven, that's fine with me. They can believe whatever they want. If materialists similarly believe that beyond the known mental world of experience lies another world which we can't know and that we can't prove exist, that's fine with me too. I just stick with what I know. I don't deny the possibility that there could be something that exists outside of consciousness, but if it exists outside of consciousness, it's unknowable. Materialists reject belief in an unknowable deity who exists outside of space and time. The world of space and time is the world of mental experience. When materialists define matter as that which has volume, they're defining matter as that which we experience as having spatial dimensions. This is in contrast to experiences like love, which we experience as dimensionless. But both love and rocks exist as experiences within our mental world. For people who are highly analytical, it's possible to think about the nature of consciousness and the structure of mental experiences. And I believe mathematics offers the best way of understanding the real world of minds and ideas. But most people don't like math, and it can seem abstract to most people. Ironically, the mathematical world of consciousness and mental experience that many people consider to be abstract is the only tangible world. What they call the physical world is purely abstract. There is nothing more tangible and knowable than your own immediate mental experiences, though, so I prefer to focus my discussions on that. As I've said, that is the real world. But how is what I'm suggesting not merely solipsism? How does idealism escape from the problem of solipsism? Like I've said, once you accept the truth that you are a conscious mind having mental experiences, and once you've accepted that the mental experiences in your mind are real, and not merely the representation of some abstract world that exists outside of consciousness, there is no problem. For the materialist, your experiences are real if they correspond to the physical world. This creates the problem of solipsism, because you can't know whether your experiences correspond to the physical world, or whether the physical world even exists. Once you let go of the unproven assumption that there is a physical world, the problem goes away. Whatever you experience is real. You really are experiencing it. The world of mental experience is the real world. So what about other people? Someone may ask. How do you know that other people are also conscious? How do you know that other people aren't just figments of your imagination? Before I answer that, I have to point out that this is a question that materialism can't answer. Let's assume that materialism is true for a moment. How do you know that other people are conscious? You only experience your own consciousness directly. When I have sex, it feels really good. I experience it subjectively. I know what it feels like to have an orgasm. If I walk in on other people having sex, and I just stand there and watch them like a creepy pervert, I infer from their behavior and moans of pleasure that they are experiencing pleasure subjectively too. But I can't observe their pleasure directly. I can only infer it indirectly. Even if they allow me to hook them up to a machine to monitor their brain activity and physiological responses, I could only observe brain activity and physiological changes that indicate orgasm. That wouldn't tell me anything about the subjective experience of actually having an orgasm. I know that I'm having thoughts and feelings. My own thoughts and feelings are accessible to me. They're not accessible to you, and yours are not accessible to me. We use inductive reasoning. We infer consciousness from behavior. You behave as if you are acting according to intention, so I infer that you're a conscious and intelligent being. This is true whether we're materialist or idealist. In either case, it's only a reasonable inference based on observation and induction. If we assume that materialism is true, it's possible to imagine that in the future, someone might create an android that is absolutely indistinguishable from a human. You can interact with it and never even suspect that it's an android. This android perfectly simulates human behavior and intelligence, but it isn't conscious. The android doesn't actually have a subjective experience. But how could you tell the difference between an android that merely simulates having human emotions and subjectivity, and a human who really is conscious and really does have emotions and subjective experiences? And if the android claimed to be conscious, could you really prove that it wasn't? Different philosophers have proposed different versions of this thought experiment. Now let's assume an idealist framework. Sure, we could present a similar problem. Let's use the matrix analogy. Let's assume you're plugged into the matrix. Let's assume that you realize that the entire world around you is actually a computer simulation. Some of the other people you see inside the matrix are real people, like you, who have been plugged in. But others are just computer programs. How do you tell which is which? As an idealist, I believe that other people are real and possess consciousness, based on inductive reasoning, just like materialists do. Just like some materialists do anyway. A lot of materialists are reductionists who deny that consciousness exists, even though consciousness is the one thing we absolutely know for certain exists. Once you acknowledge that other conscious minds exist, you're not a solipsist. Again, an idealist doesn't say that reality doesn't exist, but only that reality is mental. Pragmatically speaking, I don't see idealism as being any different from materialism. People who hold one metaphysical view will behave pretty much the same as people who hold the opposite view. There is absolutely nothing about idealism that implies that people should be able to walk through walls or anything silly like that. There's absolutely nothing about idealism that means that we can't use science. Science does not need to assume that the universe is physical. It only needs to assume that our observations and experiences of the universe confirm the existence of certain patterns and regularities. There's no reason to think that a mental universe which exists within consciousness would not display patterns and regularities. In fact, it seems far more likely to me that a mentally generated universe would be intelligible to minds than that a random and mindless universe would. The universe appears to be governed by mathematical laws. The laws of mathematics are mental, not physical. I see no reason whatsoever why anyone would expect a materialistic universe to obey the immaterial laws of mathematics, or why it should display any patterns or regularities, or why it should be intelligible to minds. If anything, it's the materialist worldview, and not the idealist worldview, that fails to provide a sufficient basis for scientific investigation. And more physicists are abandoning materialism and arriving at the conclusion that consciousness creates the universe. Materialists are dinosaurs who believe in absurd metaphysical claims on pure faith. Materialism leads to solipsism and nihilism. Idealism shows the prison to be an illusion created by the unjustified belief that materialism is true. Materialism makes knowledge impossible. It offers only inductive reasoning based on unproven metaphysical assumptions. Idealists make use of inductive reasoning too, but unlike materialists, the inductive arguments they make are built on top of logically certain premises, which are demonstrably true beyond any possible doubt. Materialism deserves nothing but ridicule. It is every bit as absurd, faith-based, and contrary to reason as the literalistic, fundamentalist, Abrahamic religions are. I'll end with that. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Peace.